everyone. Welcome back to the ABFER annual conference on today's accounting session on China-related topic. Here comes our third and last paper of today's section. We have Shuqing Law from the University of Hong Kong presenting her paper, co-authored with Cheng from SMU and Jinping Zhang from NUS on common ownership and analyst forecast. We have Peter Joos from INSEAD to discuss the paper. Shuqing, you have 25 minutes.
Thank you, Travis, and also thank the conference organizer for putting our paper into the conference. Just a clarification, because the paper was actually accepted last year and was canceled, and the conference organizer has kindly put our paper into this year's program. So the earlier version of the paper, we have the China component. And after a year, we have removed the China component of the analysis out of the paper. So the version you see in the current version is all based on the US setting. So you may feel that, well, this paper now in the current version doesn't belong to the China setting, but just this is actually the background of the paper. So the paper has so because of this, I also like to take this opportunity to apologize to Peter, because he has actually read the earlier version of the paper, and by the time we sent him the updated version, it was so different from the earlier version of the paper, so he has to read it again and then give another round of the comments for his discussion. So we apologize and thank Peter for in advance for his discussion. So the paper that is titled as a Common Ownership and Analyst Forecast, and this is co-authored with Qiang, who is, I think it's in the audience, and also Jinping from NUS, and she is a final year PhD student at the NUS who is going to join Fudan University in the coming July. So we have, in this paper, we have two keywords in the title: common ownership, and the other one is analyst forecast. So what do we mean by common ownership in this paper? So we have analysts, and analysts follow firms and issue research reports. And firms have different owners, and these are the shareholders. Analysts are also typically employed by broker firms, and broker firms, they have their own shareholders and owners. So in our setting, the common ownership that we examine is specifically refers to the common ownership between the broker firm, who hire the analyst who issue forecasts of issue research reports for the firm. So these are the common owner that we are referring to. So for convenience, so I call this owner as a common owner, and this is the co-owned firm that the analyst follows. And this is the co-owned broker who hire the analysts who issue analyst reports for the co-owned firms. And so what we examine, so this is the analyst, we call it a connected analyst. So, so what we examine in this paper is basically look at the forecast reports, specifically earnings forecast issued by these connected analysts, and comparing with the other analysts who are following the same co-owned firms, but whose employing broker firm does not have this common ownership relationship. So we are specifically looking at the forecast performance for the connected analysts and non-connected analysts, and see whether they differ. And we develop some hypotheses with regard to why they may differ, specifically in terms of the forecast accuracy and also forecast biases. So our research question is whether this type of common ownership of a broker firm and the firms the analysts covered affect analyst forecast performance. And specifically, we're using the analyst forecast accuracy and the forecast biases as the measure for forecast performance. So why we are examining this? We know that in the past maybe 10 years, that there are over the last 30 years, there has been increasingly trend of the interconnection of the firms, and particularly by having same large shareholders. And in the past 10 years, there have been increasing number of papers that examine this phenomenon, and they examine the effect of this common ownership on various corporate decisions. And so the basic conclusion from those papers is that when firms having this kind of common ownership, there is a better, because you are having the same owners, holding the portfolio firms. So there is a better collaboration among the firms that are under the same common ownership. And there's also, and this common ownership also facilitate the information communication among the firms within the same common ownership. And most of these studies that I'm referring to are specifically focusing on the information communication or collaboration among the firms in the same product market. So when I say product market, that means the firms that are in the same industry, either as an industry peer firms or as an industry competitors, or in the same supply chain, right? So the list of the papers that I list over here. So the conclusion from those studies is that because of this better collaboration among the firms in the same industry, so you will see that the firms under the same common ownership relationship, there is a because you have a better collaboration among the firms, so there is a reduced competition among the firms and among the firms under the same common ownership, and there's more strategic collaboration among those firms. And likewise, studies looking at common ownership under the same supply chain, you will see also better collaboration, and as a result, you see longer endurance of the supply chain relationship. And there's also some accounting papers look at more from the information perspective, and they find that because of the relaxed product market competition among the co-owned firms, you see that the improved information communication among the firms in the same product market, particularly in the industry peers. In other setting, that when they look at the common ownership among the acquirers and the targets, you will see better information communication for when the acquirers and the targets are sharing the same common ownership network. So, so what is interesting is that if we actually look at the universe of the investee firms by the common owners, more than half of those institution investors actually hold firms that are not in the same industry at the very broadest industry classification at the one-digit SSE code level. And so most of these firms, like 25% of these investors, they hold the shares of a financial firm and the non-financial firm. So that means that these the above mentioned studies, they missed a big chunk of the analysis because those are not included in the analysis. So we pick up this particular subset of the firms that institution shareholders hold a financial firm and a non-financial firm, and look at specifically in this setting that looking at because the broker firm and the broker firm are categorized in the financial firms categories, and specifically looking at the in the setting of analyst forecast performance. So we expect there are two non-conclusive exclusive effects on this common ownership relationship and analyst forecast performance. On the one hand is the information hypothesis, because we expect that the common ownership can help the analyst to connect the firm the management of their firm. And so in that case, that allow the analysts to have more interactions with the firm management. And also the firm, because they have a greater interaction with the firm management, presumably the firm management are like they are more likely to give preferential access to these connected analysts and allow them to get the information about the firm through different events organized by the firm, for example, conference calls or other investor relationship meetings or other corporate site visits. But because of the constraint in the data in the US setting, we only look at the conference call and we specifically test that whether these connected analysts actually are given preferential treatment with regard to the at the conference calls. And they can also, through these interactions, the analysts may also obtain the information about the firm's operation and investment activities that allow the analysts to get the information advantages concerning the firms they follow. So you may have, immediately, when because of the regulation FD, firm management may not give preferential access to material information to these analysts. And what we argue in the paper is that even though this information may not be material, but this non-material information together with the information the analysts may already have about the firm may still give the information advantages to these analysts. So that allows us to develop our first hypothesis with regard to the information hypothesis, where we expect because of the information advantages the connected analysts can get from this through this common ownership, the earnings forecasts issued by connected analysts are going to be more accurate than those forecasts issued by non-connected analysts covering the same firm. So, so that's related, specifically related to the forecast accuracy. We don't generate any prediction. We got the biases because, an analyst can be biased and accurate at the same, can also be biased and inaccurate. So we don't know what's going to be the prediction with regard to the biases. The other alternative hypothesis, which is more related to the what we claim is as a conflict of interest hypothesis, is that in this relationship, we argue that the common owners, because of this special triangular relationship, the common owners potentially can exert undue influences on the co-owned broker firm, and through various, by for example, because co-owned broker firm can, of course, they have influences on, the analyst research reports through the dissemination processes or through the tone of the analyst research reports. Why do they have the, then the question is, the first we argue that, common owner first they have an incentive to place these undue influences because, because these are the, investee firms, portfolio firms that they have. Of course, they would have, higher incentive to have a higher valuation for these firms. So as a result, if the analysts issue, more optimistic bias forecast for these co-owned firms, the valuation of those firms, if assuming they can move the market, then the valuation higher, the value of those holding would be higher. So that's the incentive component. The common owner also have the ability to influence the co-owned broker firms, and because because of the power, they can exercise the power in terms using their ownership in the firm, and also the prior studies analyze using the the JFE paper. They mentioned that owners can actually exert the using the voting power, using the voting with the feet, all these, or through the communication with the management, all these different mechanisms they can use to place to influence the decisions of the investee firms. So so in this case, if that's the case, this conflict of interest hypothesis would predict that if the common owners are placing undue influences on the co-owned broker firm that influence the research report of the connected analysts, then we would expect bias forecast by these connected analysts. So that's developed our second hypothesis, which is not directly competing, but alternative hypothesis with regard to the forecast biases issued by connected analysts. So we expect the earnings forecast issued by connected analysts are more optimistically biased than those issued by non-connected analysts following the same firm. So these so our because of this, two different hypotheses. So our empirical approach is to use the data and and test which one dominates in the U.S. setting. So let the data to tell us. So then after we documenting which effect dominance, and we conjecture, actually we have some conjecture with regard to which effect is going to dominate in the U.S. setting because of the better investor protection and also stronger institution in the U.S. And there's a lot of regulation with regard to analyst research, interest of conflicts in analyst research reports in the U.S. setting. We expect the information hypothesis would dominate, but we don't place a hypothesis in that because that's just our conjecture, right? So so after the data document this, and then we reinforce our messages using our empirical approach. Because based on the data that from our empirical results, we see that the information hypothesis, which is the H1 dominance, and then our subsequent analysis try to reinforce this the typo, the documented information hypothesis in the paper. And we use various different tests to show, first to use cross-sectional analysis to reinforce the information hypothesis that was documented after we document tested the H1 and H2. And then we use other, for example, the market reaction test also to on forecast revision by connected analysts and see whether that reconfirming our results. And then we also examine the conference call tests to see whether the connected the co-owned the management of the co-owned firms actually give the connected analysts preferential treatment in the conference call to shed light on the information channels. So overview of the results, we find that the information hypothesis dominance, the effect of common ownership between broker houses and the cover firms on analyst forecast performance, specifically on analyst forecast accuracy. And these support H1, but does not support H2. Okay, so we have some conjecture that this is mainly because of the institution in the U.S. that have all this regulation with governing the conflict of interest in analyst research reports. And then, and to make sure that, we done a battery of different tests to show that this result is robust by, after addressing this endogeneity, because there are different layers of endogeneity. The one we are mainly focusing on is, because you can have, common ownership being, the firms that actually potentially can have, why firms that have a common ownership in the first place. And then the second layer is that the analysts who, the coverage decision, right? Why analysts follow the firms that are under the, follow the co-owned firms. So our analysis is mainly focusing on the second endogeneity, because for the first one, the why firms have, why there's a common ownership, we think it's this layer of endogeneity is less important because it's unlikely that the firms, the shareholders would, co-owned broker firm and the firm itself just for the purpose of influencing the analyst forecast reports, because that's a big investment decision. It's unlikely that just for the purpose of influencing analyst reports, right? So that's a lesser concern in terms of the endogeneity issue in our particular setting. So our analysis mainly focusing on the analyst coverage decision, why firms, connected analysts cover the co-owned firms. So we use three different approaches to address this endogeneity problem. The first one is using the financial institution, the merger of financial institution. Presumably the merger of financial institution, then you would result in the changes of analyst coverage decision. And that allows us to do a DID design to look at the forecast performance pre and after the merger and see whether there is any changes in forecast performance. And then we also do the traditional PSM matching approach, and also we also do a statistical approach by using the randomly matching, randomly assign a firm to be a co-owned firm among the firms that are among other firms that the connected analysts are also following. So it's kind of a pseudo test and to reconfirm our messages. And after we adjust this, our results are robust after addressing this endogeneity, and then we conduct additional analysis to reinforce the informational effect on the effect of common ownership and analysis forecast accuracy. And so we're focusing on the cross-sectional analysis. We're focusing on mainly the two dimensions. One is the level of ownership. Because as I mentioned that the level of ownership by the common owners can potentially both affect their incentives and also their ability, right, to influence the co-owned firms. And so in that case, we find that the effect is stronger when the level of the ownership by the co-owned firms in both the broker firm and also the firm is stronger, is larger. And we also examine the incremental information value because our hypothesis kind of support the information hypothesis. So our cross-section, the next dimension of cross-section analysis focusing on the incremental information value that the analyst can get through this common ownership. By focusing on two dimensions. One is the whether the earnings are more difficult to forecast, because if the earnings are more difficult to forecast, then presumably any additional information that can bring that can brought to the analyst through this common ownership is going to be greater. So we use two proxies to measure the difficulty of to forecast the earnings for the firm. One is the earnings quality being lower, and also the operation being more complex. Right, so in those cases, the earnings are more difficult to forecast. So any incremental information that brought by the common ownership is going to be greater for the connected analyst. And then we also look at another dimension, which is, analysts can also have multiple sources of information other than through the common owners, right? So we find that the information value is going to be higher when the analyst lack of other alternative source of information. And so we use one analyst, the management guidance as one proxy for analysts an alternative source of information for the firm to generate earnings forecast for the firm. And we find that the results are stronger when analysts have fewer alternative source of information to generate earnings forecast for the firm. So in that case, the additional information source generated by the common ownership relationship in setting is stronger. And so and then we also conduct additional analysis. Which is the first one is focusing on the one of the channels through that the connected analyst can obtain the favorable treatment by the co-owned the management of the co-owned firms in the information acquisition activities, is by looking at the conference calls. So whether the connected analysts are more likely to get the question being asked. So the management are more likely to pick up the questions raised by the connected analysts during the conference calls. And this is not driven by these analysts, because there are some other studies that shows that these management pick up these analysts in the conference call because they already have a lot of information about the firm rather than there is a preferential treatment. So we do another test to show that this is actually not driven by the greater analysis effort by the connected analysts. So this kind of, it's not a complete full picture of the channels through which the connected analyst may get a preferential treatment, but this is the one thing that we can test using the data that is available in the US setting. And then we also examine the market reaction upon the forecast revisions issued by the connected analysts, and we find that the market reaction to the forecast issued by connected analysts are stronger, which is consistent with these analysts are on average more accurate, so have better reputation. So market reaction to these forecasts are more informative. So that's kind of the overall results of our paper. So we, in terms of the contribution, we extend the emerging literature on the economic consequences of the ownership by looking at this particular setting of the common ownership between broker houses and the cover firms, and how it's going to affect analyst forecast performance. And that potentially can have implication in terms of the overall information environment of the firms. And of course, another dimension of the incremental contribution of the paper is extend the literature on factors that affect analysts' research performance. So the sample that we use in the paper include the annual analyst forecast reports during that 20-year period of time. And so we pick the annual analyst forecast and the last one that were issued by analysts. And those forecasts are issued between last earnings announcement and the fiscal year end of the current year. And we also require at least 2 analysts following the same firm, and these are non-financial firms. And ownership come from the 13F. And we also require that the ownership in both the broker firm and the portfolio firm and the covered firm are more than 5%, at least 5%. So to make sure that there is significant influence by the common owner on both of these portfolio firms. Other information come from the CompuStat and CRISP. So we end up with over 300,000 analyst annual reports that are issued by 23,000 over firm years, and more than roughly 40% of the forecasts are issued by connected analysts. So on average, so this is kind of graph because there are a lot of, because it's a triangular relationship. So so this is how the data is constructed, right? So we have analysts A and B follow the firm. And so we look at the forecast performance for these A and B. On average in our sample, because we mechanically chunk out those common ownership relationship when the ownership is less than 5%. So in here you see that we have an average of 77.7% of ownership on the firm, and 8.1% of ownership in the broker houses. So to make sure that they have a significant influence on both of these firms. The top 3, in the paper we list the top 20, but due to the space constraint, we only list top 3 common owners, and these are the Vanguard, Fidelity, and the BlackRock, and they comprise a quite significant portion of the observation in our analysis. In terms of the regression model, so we have the accuracy. We use just the reverse decoded, so higher value, that means more accurate. And because it's not, because our empirical analysis, we use the relative performance, so we actually include the firm year fixed effects to scale out so that the results coefficient represent the relative performance as within the same firm year compared with analysts following the same firm. So based on our information hypothesis, we would expect a positive coefficient on forecast accuracy, and the conflict of interest hypothesis would expect a higher and more optimistic biases, which we expect also a positive coefficient. So our empirical analysis, this is our main table. So we find that both positive, so you use both a dummy variable and also the uncommon, which is the number of common owners. But on average, we have 1 point something, which is less than 10, less than 2. So it's basically robust to and using alternative definition for the common owners. biases. So this is we find a positive significant coefficient on this variable, so that which support the H1. For biases, we don't find anything. We don't find anything. So we as we mentioned that we use different approaches to address this endogeneity to make sure that our results are robust before we proceed with additional analysis to reinforce the messages. So we use, as I mentioned, that the DID approach by focusing the merger of financial institutions that create the exogenous formation of the common ownership. And so we find that, using this DID specification, that we continue to find the positive coefficients on the accuracy results, but no results for the biases. Likewise, when you use the PSM approach or the falsification test, so in the falsification test, we have the same analyst following multiple firms, right? So you have one connected analyst and then one co-owned firm, and then the other firms that are followed by the same analyst who is that is not a co-owned firms. So we randomly assign any of these non-co-owned firms as a pseudo co-owned firm, and then do another, compare with the forecast for performance for those firms, compare with other analysts following the same pseudo co-owned firms, and we don't find any differences. So that kind of reinforce the messages. So as we mentioned before that, we use the incremental value of the information. One is through the level of ownership. So we use the incremental. So this is a dummy variable when the stake in the ownership in the firm and also the stake in the ownership of the ownership in the broker firm is in the 90 percentile. So it's high, very high. So that has an incremental value, incremental effect on the accuracy. Then in the cross-sectional analysis, as we mentioned, that we have three additional proxies. One is using the accounting information, using the quality of accounting information. And also the earnings are more difficult in terms of operational complexity, and then whether there is an analyst management forecast. So we find that when earnings are more difficult to forecast, the incremental value of the information obtained through the common ownership is greater. And when there's no management guidance from the co-owned firms, you see there's a negative effect. So that means so because the management forecast here is the dummy is equal to 1 when there is management forecast. So reversely, you can interpret it as when there's lack of alternative source of information, then the effect of the common ownership is greater. And so we also use it as the one channel through which the management of the co-owned firms give preferential treatment to the connected analysts is through by answering questions raised by connected analysts. And so we use the conference call to see whether management are more likely to pick up the question by this co-owned connected analysts, and we find they do. So that give us some evidence that these analysts are given preferential treatment by the management of the co-owned firms. And this is not driven by greater efforts exerted by these co-owned firms. And market reaction, forecast revision by these co-owned connected analysts are stronger. So that is consistent with these analysts are being more accurate and have a better reputation in the product in the capital market. So the forecasts issued by these connected analysts are more informative. Which collaborate with the evidence, we find that that these analysts are more accurate in general. So the conclusion is that the common ownership between broker houses and the firms that they cover improve the connected analysis forecast performance in terms of forecast accuracy. But these effects vary cross-sectionally in the two settings. One is through the level of common ownership, and then when the value of the information is more relevant. And this is supported by the mechanism, the channel test, and also the market reaction test. And the market reaction test also collaborate with the evidence that forecast revision for this by these connected analysts are stronger than those issued by non-connected analysts. So that's all my paper. I'm looking forward to Peter's discussion. Thank you.
All right. Am I supposed to speak now?
I think so.
Yes, Peter, it's your turn.
All right. Let me do. Let me share the screen here. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
And then, well, I'm sorry, but you'll have to look at me as well. So, thank you very much, Shuqing. I appreciate it. I enjoyed that presentation. I want to start by thanking Travis for hosting a wonderful session. And I want to definitely thank the organizers for inviting me to the conference this year. As some of you may know, this conference is close to my heart. I've been here every single year since I moved to Singapore, which is now about 6 years ago. I presented a paper, I helped organize it, and this year is the first time I actually have been invited to discuss a paper. Now, to be fair, when I saw the other two discussants of this morning, I thought, oh boy, because when you're up against, well, you're not up against, but still, Oliver presented a wonderful discussion, Doug did the same thing, so here I am, no pressure. But let me talk about the paper. All right, so this is Common Ownership and Analyst Forecast by Cheng, Shuqing, and Jinping. And I apologize if I mispronounce any names here. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm not going to spend too much time summarizing the paper. You know what it's about. Shuqing highlighted that, the combination between, you know, on the one hand, you have a brokerage, you have a covered firm, and you have a common owner that owns a stake in both of these firms. So how do analysts sort of respond to this setting? And I think the main finding, I guess, would be common ownership turns out to be a good thing, right? And the way we get to that conclusion is we look at two hypotheses. One is an information hypothesis where the common ownership helps the accuracy of forecasts. And then we have a conflict of interest hypothesis where potentially the common ownership would lead to biased forecast. And the evidence is in line with the improved accuracy and no evidence of optimistic bias, and that's great. The authors are very careful to make sure that we can believe their results. They as Shuqing highlighted, they do battery of tests on endogeneity. They do cross-sectional tests overall. It's a comprehensive paper that gets to a particularly sharp conclusion. All right. Now, as she mentioned also, I did discuss the paper twice, I guess once in my living room, and today I do it here. And this is only my fault because it was a moment of overzealousness on my part after some heavy teaching at INSEAD. I thought, let's do this discussion first because I actually like doing these things. But the authors, you know, did change the paper. And I have to commend them because the paper is actually a thorough rewrite of the original paper, which did focus on the US and China, and in particular the institutional features, so the differences between those two markets. That said, I think this current version of the paper is a lot tighter and shorter as well, and I think my comments sort of will be, by extension, also a lot crisper. So let's start with the starting point. The authors start by pointing out that there's a lot more common ownership in the US between firms. And they start by citing evidence from finance literature, econ literature, and accounting literature that this has led to a number of results on strategic coordination, frictions associated with incomplete contracting in supply chain, facilitating information communication, lots of stuff that is relevant. But what they do, and I think this is important, they actually bring this notion of common ownership into the world of sell-side analysts. And to my knowledge, this has not been done. And it's actually an interesting idea if you think about the fact that this is actually quite common. I mean, they cite the number on page 1 of their paper, 25% of institutional investors hold at least one brokerage and one firm. So that is important. The nice thing is it leads to a positive conclusion, but I should add, and Shuqing referred to that, I want to emphasize that this is in the context of the US, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. All right. From where I'm sitting, this is good stuff. You know, as some of you might know, I spent considerable time of my professional life working with analysts. And it's always nice to read something good about them. It looks like analysts have a role to play. And I do think that understanding the environment as well as we can to sort of be able to interpret their work, I think that's important. However, and this is the thing that of course, the discussion always has to bring, I think I need to understand a couple of things better to be able to actually sort of understand the results of the paper and actually distinguish it from potentially alternative scenarios. And I'll bring them to the discussion. So a couple of topics that I want to talk about. What's so special about this common ownership? Some issues on research design, then something which I call tidbits. I might skip those in the interest of time. And then the role of institutional setting. All right. So here we go. Common ownership. What is the economics? Well, the idea is that a common shareholder will try to maximize its stake in all of the common firms. All right. Now, this case is very specific here, right? Because here we're talking about a firm that owns both a brokerage and a covered firm, which is different from a lot of what these econ and finance papers do, where you have peer companies and things like that. Now, the original version of the paper did hint at another setting where we observed this, the setting where there's credit analysts and co-ownership, and the reference there was the paper by Kedia et al. In the JFE. And there, in fact, the results were the opposite of what the authors find here. And the story there is a little bit more tight in terms of like, what can we expect to see from a co-owned relationship between, you know, a credit rating agency and another firm. So my question here is, and this is something I really would like to understand a little bit better, like what are these co-ownerships? Are these random occurrences? I don't think so, right? And again, I think it is a contribution of the paper to highlight this notion that these co-ownerships exist. And frankly, I would like to understand a little bit better, like who is being co-owned here? What is the nature of the brokerages? What is the nature of the covered firms? I think that might help a little bit, because ultimately, I think the story that the authors are trying to tell is one that varies from, you know, co-ownership helps facilitation, or it helps control of actions of the parties involved. And that's a subtle difference. And maybe if we understand better what the types of firms are that are in these co-ownership relations, that might help understand a little bit better what we're going to see in terms of the results. All right. So co-ownership. Now, I cite a couple of things from the paper here, because I just want to be clear on what the authors are assuming. First, they talk about the mechanics of the information hypothesis, which leads to further or more accuracy of forecast. And basically what they write is, and they write it in a careful language, but they suggest that if you're a connected analyst working for a company that is co-owned, you likely have better access to management, and you likely might get preferential treatment in terms of information gathering activities such as conference calls, etc. And I'm just wondering, why would the co-owner want this? What is the value for a co-owner of better public forecasts made by these analysts? Is it because analysts can do something that the co-owner cannot? Because if it is about getting information, I think the paper cites a lot of evidence that there is an influence of these co-owners on the firms that they own, right? Not brokerages, but the firms, the typical sort of like, you know, industrial firms that they own. So I'm just wondering, it would help me to understand a little bit better what we're after here. And if there is a benefit, how big is it? All right, because it seems a bit costly to coordinate all these parties, right? Do these forecasts improve the wealth of the co-owner? If so, how? And do these better forecasts affect the value of the broker or even the covered firm? It would be nice to comment on that a little bit so that we can understand what the mechanism is. And I complete this page by saying that, again, the authors write the paper in a very careful language, and I commend that. But they do state, we argue that connected analysts use the common ownership between their employers and covered firms to seek favorable treatment in information gathering activities. And that's actually pretty strong language. And I'm not sure that I can fully be on board with that. And I'll propose an alternative mechanism to maybe get to the same results in terms of accuracy as we see. Here's the second one. And the second one is a focus on bias. So now we've gone from the good outcome, accuracy, to the not so good outcome. And what the authors suggest here is that it has to do with, you know, the fact that if you have influence on these analysts, you can actually nudge them. You can impair their independence. You can actually prompt them to issue biased forecasts. And they go as far as to say that, you know, these relationships might actually affect the tone of the analyst research and also the selection of reports that get published. And I'm just a little bit hesitant on this because, again, I worked in that environment. I'm not sure that I observed a lot of that, especially when it comes to tone. The way compliance functions in sell-side research work is that the tone is checked by compliance. And the tone is not written down in a research note, at least where I worked, by the analysts themselves, but rather it is verified by editorial teams and legal teams, etc. So there is a lot of layer there that sort of makes sure that actually the tone of certain analyst research should not be too much biased in one way or the other, in one direction or the other. So I'm a little bit hesitant on believing that this is actually taking place as strongly as perhaps this paragraph might suggest. Now, why this influence? Again, the authors say, well, you know, basically these co-owners have a benefit if there's higher stock prices. So that's why this stuff happens. And so again, my question then is, how big is this benefit? Are there trading incentives? And to be fair, in the other version of the paper, the authors had a test on this in the setting of China, and they actually found evidence consistent with that. What is in it for the brokerage house? Is it not hurtful to the co-owned analyst or to the co-owner if these co-owned analysts are being perceived as really being biased, right? And I'll comment on that with a paper by Malmandir and Shanti Kumar in just a second. Would the market not see through this, all right? And then practically, how would this work? And this is one where I really struggle a little bit, because when the authors talk about how co-owners influence firms, they speak specifically about the firms that we would call here the covered firm. I don't think there's a lot of debate or discussion on how this percolates inside a sell-side research organization, this influence. And I'm just hesitant that it might not be there. Now, again, I'm mindful of the time. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We can handle questions later, perhaps. But this table is very informative because this is specific for the US setting. And Shuqing showed it already. The three big ones there are Vanguard, Fidelity, and BlackRock. All right. And this is interesting, right? Because if you look at settings, and I just want to show a practical example. All right. So here we have two big brokerages, Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. And these brokerages cover companies like Lululemon and Under Armour. I picked these because somehow my MBAs wear a lot of Lululemon, but they also care about the company a lot. So this is a topic of conversation in all my classes that I teach now. Now, when you go to CapIQ, you can actually find out who the top holders are. And indeed, Vanguard, BlackRock, and there's also T. Rowe there, they basically feature both on the side of the brokerages and on the side of Lululemon. But this is interesting, right? Because we're having a lot of competitors sort of in the same picture here, right? And so there's dynamics there that probably should be thought of as well when we try to think about outcomes. It gets a little bit tighter even when you look at who covers these stocks at Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. Well, Lululemon is covered by Kimberly Greenberger, and Matthew Boss covers Lululemon at JP Morgan. Turns out the same people, of course, cover Under Armour at the same firms. So these analysts cover basically the same type of co-owned firms. And so there's a lot of players here. And so it actually is interesting to look at some outcomes. And I realize this is anecdotal, all right? But you know, what do we expect to see if we believe the story? Well, I look at first Lululemon, all right? And this is a couple of months ago. The ratings of Morgan Stanley are equal weight and overweight for JP Morgan. So I guess JP Morgan would be consistent with perhaps what the authors think. Turns out, though, when you look at the earnings forecasts, both Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan are significantly below consensus. So, you know, that sort of, it's not clear sort of whether the influence there did not work or whether something else is at play. When you then go to Under Armour, both ratings are neutral or equal weight. And here it turns out that the analysts are actually, while being neutral, they both have higher forecast than consensus. And again, this is purely anecdotal, and I know that. But I was closing my eyes, going to CapIQ, going to these reports, and hoping to see evidence that would be completely consistent with this. And it seems that there might be some other things at play here. All right. So again, going back to this picture, and I think this is a slide that I want to emphasize a little bit. It turns out that when you look at this, Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock are not just the owners of Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. Turns out they are the most important clients of Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan sell side. And again, having worked there, I remember distinctly, we had this laminated piece of paper on our desk with a ranking of clients. And the rule was very simple. We had different tiers of clients, and clearly Vanguard, Fidelity, and BlackRock were in the top tier. And the rule was very simple. If those guys call, you drop whatever you do and you cater to their needs. And they would call, right? They would definitely call if they have stakes in these covered firms like Lululemon and Nike. So maybe it's not the sort of trickling down the hierarchy of the firm, of the co-ownership that actually guides the analysts, but maybe it's just catering to the clients. And so there's a paper that's coming out in Management Science by Chu et al. And basically they showed that there is analyst responsiveness to institutional investors' attention. And this is really consistent with some of the things that I think I observed, in the sense that if those guys call, you drop everything and you focus your attention on it. So it's almost like, you know, you can find the results that you find by just sort of saying, you know, it's the effort of the analyst, the strategic attention, if you wish, to cater to the most important clients that might lead to the outcomes, because they would like to see accuracy and they might not want to see bias. It seems a little bit more straightforward than I think this co-ownership trickling down effect that you described. Speaking to that, it also, you know, when you look at these numbers, these are very tight distributions, and I know that you have a particular way of selecting this. I'm just wondering, how large is large enough to nudge analysts within a big sell-side organization to actually change the tone, or perhaps you know, change something to the reports that they were writing. That's something on Uncommon, but I'll skip that in the interest of time. All right. Now, further on this common, what you also observe is when you look at the descriptives, it is striking how different everything is between the common and the non-common analyst. What is interesting is that accuracy shows up descriptively in the right direction, but bias doesn't. And I thought that was intuitive, but you know, the paper is relatively silent on that. But what I also want to emphasize on this page is that when you look at common versus not common, right, you see big differences in terms of experience and in terms of brokerage. And actually, that's a result that Chu et al. Find in their catering to the client. They find that catering to the client is actually stronger for analysts with more experience and for analysts that work for larger brokerages. So I guess what I'm saying is that maybe it's that client link that drives it, and it's not the effect of common. I mean, the outcome is similar, obviously, but it's just a different mechanism that leads to it. I make some comments on the regression, but in the interest of time, one thing to note as well is that I think it would be important, and I'm going to not go into the detail, but I'll share my slides, obviously. I think the role of brokerage should also not be underestimated in this design. It is the case probably, and that's why I was asking, do we know who these co-owned firms are and co-owned brokerages? I think the co-owned firms are the ones with the big resources. And resources, as we know, can lead to better accuracy and not necessarily bias. So maybe an alternative mechanism is indeed a resource mechanism. It's catering to the client and you've got the means to do it. It's not necessarily you were told to focus on that or maybe change the tone, etc. Now, one other thing that I think would be interesting, and I'll just show everything that sits on this slide here, I think it would be interesting to look at analyst behavior across their coverage. Analysts do rank stocks within their coverage, and I would be interested to see how they rank connected versus non-connected stocks. So if you could do within analyst tests, that would actually be interesting. And it refers to, and I, you know, when you do a discussion, you cite your own research, I've been told. This fits a little bit with analyst distraction, right? I mean, what does the analyst focus on? And especially in terms of accuracy, it's about what probably they spend most of their time on. When you look at analyst changes, I actually would be interested to see if you have any evidence of analysts becoming non-connected. So they were connected and now they become non-connected. You know, maybe they get demoted, right? Because they probably have to move to a smaller brokerage, but maybe Vanguard is still a client there. So would they still be as accurate? Or if Vanguard is no longer a client, would they now drop the accuracy because they have to spread their attention over a wider range of stocks? Those would be things. There's a lot of endogeneity there. I appreciate that. But maybe that gets to some of the issues. All right. And in the interest of time, I have a lot of other things that I talk about. One thing, though, this is the last slide, and then I'll get to my conclusions. I do think that it would be interesting to look at the combination of recommendations and earnings forecast. And the reason I say this is there's a good paper written a while back by Malmandir and Shanti Kumar on speaking in two tongues. The analysts do different things, right? And they talk about the fact that if the analyst actually does strategic distortion, they expect to see recommendations being biased upwards, but not forecasts. In footnote 14, the authors here say that they find the same thing, which actually would be consistent with non-strategic distortion as per that paper. And so maybe by putting these two together, you could find evidence on whether it is the common ownership at work, or maybe it's just the analyst being biased in an optimistic sense. All right. Again, in the interest of time, I'll skip a bunch of things because I had a whole bunch of comments more. But basically, I can summarize all my comments and tidbits as follows. If the only thing you have is a hammer, everything that you look at is a nail. And so I'm more on the side of, like, it's the client catering thing that's at work here. And so all the evidence, I mean, most of the evidence in the paper, I think one can interpret in that particular way. One final thing on the institutional setting. It's a pity in a way that the Chinese setting is no longer there, because I thought that was actually an interesting and clever way to contrast these hypotheses. The authors still refer to this, but unfortunately, since it's only one setting, they cannot provide a lot of evidence on it because you only work within one setting. And so I would say maybe going back to a double setting or a dual setting could help tease out a little bit whether it is the common ownership at work, yes or no. And probably it can help put to bed a lot of my alternative stories. All right, I'll stop. Important topic. I think it is a contribution of the paper to highlight this particular relation. It's well written. The authors have done a lot of work executing these tests. I guess my only suggestion is it might not be the common ownership at work. There might be some other mechanisms. And then this weekend, I came across a paper that's forthcoming in JFE. All the papers that have been out there on common ownership are actually put in question by this particular paper that is coming out in JFE. It's a good paper. It gives a good overview. And Katrina Llewellyn and Michelle Lowry basically rerun a lot of tests. And they say, well, you know what? If you control for a bunch of things, that common ownership effect that a lot of these papers find, maybe it's just not there. Maybe it's just something else that's happening. So I guess the debate continues. I do wish the authors the best of luck with their paper.
Thank you so much, Peter. Switching, we have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Peter, for very insightful comments. I would like to actually comment on two things. The one is whether it's one setting or two settings, because as we mentioned that in the earlier version paper, we have contrasting results in the China setting where we find this H2, which is a conflict of interest hypothesis dominance in the China setting, and then we argue the institution setting being weaker. And so, of course, this is a taste issue, and we had a lot of difficulty when we present that version of the paper around. So this is actually the first time we present the newer version of the paper. So, and the other point is about to address the well. By the way, can you actually send us your slide, because there are a lot of useful comments and
I will send it.
Comments. Yeah. The other comment about Peter's comment about catering alternative explanation, because in our setting that we find that actually the effort that are actually exerted by these connected analysts are not greater than the non-connected analysts. So to that extent, that actually doesn't support. Well, of course, it's not just one-dimensional test, but that's something that we need to think about. But thank you very much. Oh, the other point is about the recommendation. So we do have a footnote that we actually test using recommendation as another dimension of the test for our H2, because for recommendation, we can only test the conflict of interest hypothesis because you can only measure the optimism for the recommendation, but not accuracy dimension for the H1 in the information hypothesis. So that's why we were struggling whether we should put a recommendation in the paper, because we can only test the H2. So that's why that it's only included in the footnote. But I'm open to other than that, but thank you very much. And I have a few minutes, so maybe just that open the floor for questions.
I think we have only 1 minute left. Do we have any questions from the audience? This is your not the last chance. If you have questions, you are always welcome to contact the author directly. Since we are just about out of time, so let me conclude this session by saying thank you to all the fabulous presenters and discussants for contributing to today's excellent program. And to all three discussants, I'm sure you have set the bar very high for tomorrow's accounting sessions. You guys are doing the hard work. Up next, we will have the academic keynote by Professor Stephen Davis. Have a great day ahead, and goodbye.
Thank you.